This lesson is entitled, How is Your Dressing? This session is intended to bring further clarification to the topic of the preparation of the bride for the marriage supper of the Lamb. Let me start with this statement. God is making man. His revealed will is the making of man, one man from all his creation. That is the creation of mankind. Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 and 27. Now, God's intention was never for man to be naked, but that they should be covered in righteousness. To be naked would expose his choice creation and make them vulnerable to the wiles of his arch enemy Satan and his fallen angels, who were dethroned from their first estate, that is their heavenly abode. In making man to be like himself meant that man, as bride, was to be fully dressed in the garment of salvation and robed in his righteousness. When sin entered, the righteous covering was removed from Adam and Eve, and they saw that they were naked and therefore hid from God. Genesis chapter 2 verse 25, and also Genesis chapter 3 verse 7 to 11. Remember the famous scripture when God asked Adam and Eve, "Who told you you were naked?" As already stated, man in his nakedness would be exposed to the fallen nature of sin and its consequences. For example, shame, pride, deception, greed, lust, pain, grief, sorrow, envy, lies, covetousness, murder, and death. In choosing Israel as the bride for his son, thus, therefore, began the preparation of dressing the bride to be ready for the marriage ceremony when mortality and divinity would be joined. John chapter 17 verse 22 and 23, and 2 Peter verse 1 and chapter 1 verse 4. We see, therefore, apart from being dressed ready for the marriage supper of the Lamb, God's covering of the bride was to protect her from the fiery darts of the enemy. In the battle for the souls of men, we would know that it is the plan and strategy of Satan to kill, steal, and to destroy mankind. John chapter 10 verse 10. Whereas God's plan for man is to give him life and life more abundantly. Now, let us consider the varied form of covering as seen from the scripture. 1. The covering with fig leaf by Adam and Eve was mainly to cover their physical nakedness in the same way that we cover ourselves with clothing. 2. God then instituted a second form of covering with the coats of skin from animals to protect them from the consequences of the curse of nature, for example, thorns and thistles. This also represented the first sacrificial covering, in that in order to take the skin off animals, blood had to be shed. 3. The sacrificing of animals' blood by men represented a temporary covering for the guilt of sin. 4. However, Christ shedding his blood through his death and resurrection is the final covering for the sins of mankind. This last two covering also protected mankind from the mental and spiritual attacks from the fiery darts of Satan. The clothing of mankind with the garment of salvation and being robed in righteousness is not only the final covering for man's sinfulness, but the final dress code for the marriage supper of the Lamb and the wedding garment of the church, the New Jerusalem, is found in Revelation 21 verse 1. In summary, we can now see that the express purpose of being dressed in the garments of salvation is the first stage of the dressing of the bride, and being robed in righteousness is the final stage of the readiness of the individual and collectively of the church as the final covering for the readiness of the bride for the marriage supper of the Lamb.